I am presenting my research proposal video for the Masters in International Music Business to you via my office. I have spent a lot of time in here in the last year and this attempt at the video is quite difficult, so I understand why Courtney and David did PowerPoint presentations, so good on you guys. Anyway, I will move forward. Thanks for your patience with me and this video. Okay, so when I first started looking at a research issue and problem for the research earlier in the year, I looked at the Australian quota system. And sorry for my ums, I started off on the quota system on the Australian commercial radio, as I believed that there is not enough Australian music being played. So I did a lot of reading and I did a lot of research and found that Australia is locked into a 25% Australian content due to the free trade agreement with the US in 2004, which I'll cover later. So I believe though that, and I think a lot of the industry does, is that we would like to see more. We would like to see more than 25%. And what would be great is if it was regulated and enforced. It seems that the only way to achieve this is to get commercial radio to want to play more Australian music. So understanding the attitudes and the reasons why commercial radio is reluctant to play more Australian music is important for the growth of the industry. So many academics and government bodies have examined the effects that quotas have on the industry, but there are no studies on the motives and deterrence of supporting local content. So the aim of this research project is to understand commercial radio's attitude towards supporting local content and to see what needs to be changed and to gain stronger support for the local music scene. Because the more Australian music can be played on commercial radio, the better and healthier the local music industry will be. More sales, more people at gigs. It just makes a lot of sense. Anyway, the study will examine the current debate in light of today's media landscape, and it will identify the attitudes that various stakeholders have and seek to address them with the most current data. So this research will benefit the music industry in general and music industry bodies such as APRA, AMCOS, AMCOM, Music Council of Australia, Australian Independent Record Association, Commercial Radio Australia, and government legislators like Music Victoria, Music New South Wales, Music Queensland, etc. And as I mentioned, the music industry in general. When I have spoken to people in the industry about my research project and what I wanted to do and look into quotas and the quota system in Australia, every single person, musician, music industry professional, has said to me, yes, this really needs to be done. We really need this research. So that's why I want to do it. The impact of the research project and the investigation into the attitude of commercial radio with regard to local content will be far-reaching within the industry, as I said, and it will give new insight into filling the gap and will fill the gap in research literature on Australian music content on commercial radio, because at present there isn't very, very much at all. So just briefly, government thinking and regulations. Well, the government has had a long history with support for local content, starting in 1942 as part of the Broadcasting Act. Then in years following, the local content was raised from 2.5%, which was very, very minimal. Finally, in 2004, due to the Australian-US Free Trade Agreement, caps on the music quotas were set at 25% and deregulation of the quota system was enforced. So that means, as I said, it's pretty obvious. The radio stations are not regulated and the quota system is not enforced. It's a self-regulation system. And what happens, and what I have already found out, is that music programmers at various stations don't actually meet the quota system, but there's no one really checking, so they fudge their reports and there is no one enforcing this. So what I think really needs to happen is it needs to be enforced and regulated, but we need to do a lot of research before that. Many government bodies have recognised the cultural importance of Australian content, and the Australian Music Performance Code states that the objectives of the code is to promote the role of broadcasting services in developing and reflecting a sense of Australian identity, character and cultural diversity by prescribing minimum content levels of Australian music. So this just means that they believe, the government and government bodies and the Australian Performance Code believes that we need to have more Australian music and more Australian content on Australian radio, because the Australian voice needs to be heard, the Australian song needs to be heard, or we lose our cultural identity. And this is really important. Otherwise, we're bombarded by music from the US and the UK, in particular the US, and there'll be generations of people growing up with no idea of Australian music, and Australian culture. So, in recent research, academics have found that it has been established that radio airplay has a clear effect on the production and consumption of music, and as such, requirements for the broadcast of local music can be used as an efficient means of stimulating and maintaining musical practice. So it's really, really important to keep Australian music on air. In a recent review of the Department of Broadband Communications and Digital Economy, they applied quotas to local content on digital radio broadcasting services, because Commercial Radio Australia were campaigning for all quotas to be removed completely, because they were saying that it was hard for them to compete against digital broadcasters, and why should they have to play a set quota system and a 25% or less, and digital broadcasters didn't have to play it. So the review of Convergence thankfully held firm and applied quotas to digital radio as well. So now it's a level playing field and between traditional radio and digital media. And despite this, the report identified two opposing constituencies, and one comprising of commercial broadcasters, surprise, surprise, and the other music performers and the music industry interests, so the music industry in general. The study seeks to identify the key issues between these two groups, and that's what I want to look at, and what it is, what the opposing issues are, and how we can actually make it work. While quotas are an important part of the conversation, when it comes to discourse about local content, they by no means are the whole story. Some radio stations are exceeding their quotas and others are barely meeting the obligations. And there is currently no research examining the effectiveness of quotas and how these mandatory obligations influence the attitude of radio stations and programming their formats. There is no comprehensive understanding of what interests and motives drive the content programmed by commercial radio, except, as I have heard a lot of people say, that music is just used as fillers between the advertising. And commercial radio are making a lot of money on advertising. The idea behind this research is to gain a better understanding of what problems need to overcome in order for local content to gain a wider support within the commercial radio sector. Current data seems to indicate that the majority of stations are just meeting their obligations, while others exceed the quota by a large margin. This research aims to find out what the thinking is behind these different levels of support. So examining attitudes and motives for support or lack thereof of local content is crucial in understanding how Australian content can grow beyond the mandatory 25%. With this in mind, the rationale behind the research question is to identify the attitudes towards the local content along with the outcomes produced by the current model. So the first part of the research will be a comparative study between three markets, Australia, New Zealand and Canada. I will gather information on the current models in Canada and New Zealand and will identify issues and opinions of these markets by investigating and comparing the effectiveness of the Canadian market the Canadian model, sorry, a market that has a strong 35% quota system in place with a healthy local industry. So Canada has a 35% local quota. It's called CanCon, and it is enforced between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. Canadian commercial radio stations must play 35% Canadian music, local Canadian music. And due to this, the Canadian local industry is very, very healthy indeed. So I want to compare their quota system. I will also look at New Zealand on the other side of the spectrum with its deregulated market will also be examined. So New Zealand in 2004 also signed the free trade agreement with the US, but they weren't so lucky and they removed their quota system completely. This research project will examine the attitudes of commercial radio in both countries, New Zealand and Canada, and examine the current support for local content and how they are surviving, how is New Zealand coping with the deregulated market, and how Canada deal with their 35% CanCon. So questions and some of the things that the study will be looking into will be, are Canadian radio stations exceeding the 35%? And what are the attitudes to the strict CanCon rules? And I'll also asking how much airplay do Kiwi artists receive in their local market? And what motivates New Zealand commercial stations to add New Zealand content? So by examining and comparing the strongly regulated Canadian system with New Zealand's deregulated approach, the study will seek to understand how different interventions affect the attitudes of commercial radio station decision makers. Comparing the positives or negatives of different systems will help identify what issues need to be addressed and should lead to better practices, and that's for Australia. So I will use qualitative data for interviewing key music representatives. The research will gather insight from all stakeholders, allowing the audience to identify their concerns and express their agendas. So as I'm handling publicity for AWMI, which takes place in Melbourne next week, which is the Australasian Worldwide Music Expo, my involvement with AWMI will give me a great opportunity to liaise with the music industry personnel from around the world, and in particular Canada and New Zealand. So I am planning, if this proposal is accepted, to set up some face-to-face consultations with delegates from both Canada and New Zealand. And they are currently being arranged, and these interviews will be recorded and used to develop the interview structure and subject matter for the project.